Good evening, everybody. This is the 80s slasher librarian coming to you for the next installment of Jason X The Experiment. Jason X The Experiment, Chapter 4. His first stroke took the blade through her diagonally, from the point of her left shoulder all the way to her right hip bone. The soft, juicy stuff inside her burst forth in an uneven, gory bloom that didn't last even as long as a heartbeat, certainly not as long as her heartbeat. He brought the machete up and swung it down again, this time from the opposite direction, and felt the sound of it chopping through meat and bone as much as he heard it again and again. He raised the machete and slashed downward from different angles. There was almost nothing to her, just chunks of flesh and bone roughly carved by a blade of cold steel. After the first few strokes, it was like cutting through wet paper. When he was done, there was nothing, less than nothing, left. The voice in Cosgrove's communication unit belonged to a very young guy named Estep, who was trying very hard to sound professional rather than shaken. Mara's dead. The security chief didn't hesitate, didn't say, "What?" or "Are you sure?" or anything else. Cosgrove wasn't wired that way, and it had saved his life more than once. It took perhaps all of 10 seconds for him to get from his desk to Estep's cubicle in the nerve center. Estep, meanwhile, was not too shaken to know he should just sit tight for the few moments it would take for his boss to get to him. He used the time to work on his composure. He sat motionless at the semicircular console with Mara's readout set for the screen directly in front of him. The two screens on either side had been rotating through different views of the protesters outside, as well as the interior of the house that served as their headquarters. Facing Estep's console was a framework with a further 24 screens, half of them active and the rest on standby. Cosgrove had put the setup together himself, a good part of it literally using his own tools, after which he personally selected and trained a team of 8, including Estep, to keep track of field operatives like Mara. The job had turned out to involve a great deal more than trying not to die of boredom, as Estep had originally thought. He found himself developing a fascination with human behavior, which became even more intense when he was assigned to Mara. It wasn't just the fact that she was so riddled with bugs he didn't need a standard visual surveillance camera to see her. It was the image the bugs produced, or rather how the image was rendered by the console's graphics. Mara had no cams or microphones on or in her. The protesters swept regularly for body spyware. But the vitamins she took wouldn't have raised any flags even if the group had had the right kind of hardware to pick up biochemical activity. It would have been ideal if she could have transmitted whatever she saw and heard. But as things stood, security always knew her precise location as well as her physical condition. Not only whether she was alive or dead, but also if she were asleep or awake, hungry or tired, sick or healthy, high or sober. And once Estep had been trained in how to interpret certain things, the readings also told him quite a lot about her physiological and emotional states. Estep's own emotional state was mixed. To know so much about another person in such intimate detail sometimes made him feel like a bizarre cross between a guardian angel and a stalker. Lately, he kept forgetting that he had never met Mara, so when her sudden, violent death had shown up on the monitor, the shock had hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly Cosgrove walked into the cubicle and Estep felt his own nerves become steadier in response to the man's presence. "What happened?" the chief asked. Looking up at Cosgrove, Estep opened his mouth to say, "The readings indicate she was violently dismembered with no warning." But what actually came out was, "Some psycho fuck just fucking hacked her to fucking ribbons, sir." Cosgrove didn't bat an eye, possibly because Estep had spoken in such a calm and professional tone. "We know there's at least one machete. A regular visitor uses it on the undergrowth. You think he made her?" Estep hesitated. If he did, there was something else going on besides Mara's cover getting blown. None of these people get violent with each other. Right. They destroy property, not people. Drugs or illness, maybe? He seemed about to go on and then suddenly stood up a little straighter, a slight frown on his face. Estep knew he was listening to his comlink. Whatever he was hearing, it was not good news. Abruptly, he leaned over the console and retuned one of the other monitors. The display changed from a long shot of the protesters as seen from inside the console to a heavily enhanced close-up from a telephoto zoom. Even with the enhancements, however, it took a second or two before Estep realized he was looking at more than some damaged trees and a few torn-up bushes. Stunned, he turned to look at Cosgrove. "Is that?" Cosgrove responded by making a few more adjustments. A graphics program woke up and went to work quickly, erasing select portions of undergrowth. Interpolating from known data, it filled in the rest of the face that had been partially obscured behind the leaves and branches. Within a minute, Estep could see not only that it was Sawyer Orestes, but also that it was only Sawyer Orestes' head, impaled on the end of a thick branch stuck in the ground like a post. "Yes," Cosgrove said matter-of-factly, "it is." Stunned, Estep turned to look at him. "You don't think it was that other girl?" Cosgrove shook his head solemnly. "No. She'll be next, though, if she isn't dead already. And I know for sure it's not one of us. Obviously, we have a surprise mystery guest who doesn't like our protester friends. And whoever it is may not like the power station any better." He barely paused as he returned to the rest of Estep's monitors. "I'm closing Mara and filing everything we've got as is. This is your new assignment." Estep felt a wave of uncertainty sweep through him as he looked around at the new displays. "What am I watching for?" Cosgrove made a fast noise that might actually have been a laugh. "You'll know when you see it." Lynn had found the temptation of a second deli-style sandwich too much to resist. She ate, slowly, savoring each bite while she told herself that having a third would be an inappropriate and unprofessional display of overindulgence, and absolutely out of the question. Thus preoccupied, she had eaten about half of it before she noticed the armed guard in the midst of some rose bushes 20 feet away. She might not have noticed him at all, except that he stood up from the bench where he had been sitting, partially obscured by a bush of fat pale pink blossoms twice the size of her fist. He hadn't jumped up with any real urgency, but it was a quick movement nonetheless, and it caught her eye. Sitting back, she pretended to stretch so she could look around without making a point of it. She counted 3 others besides the one visible to her over Kai's right shoulder, none looking especially wary, all of them heavily armed. There had to be a few more she couldn't see without being obvious about what she was doing. Had they been there all along? And were there more that no one could see? Apparently, Olsen wasn't fooling around when it came to the matter of security. Understandable. There was no guarantee that all of the protesters outside the fence were nobly intentioned, or virtuous, or even just harmless, or always in plain sight. The guard near the rosies seemed casual enough. He was standing with one foot up on the bench and his weapon resting on his bent knee. But he gazed steadily out at Veronica Lake without looking away even for a second, and Lynn could tell from the position of his hand that his finger was actually right on the trigger. Sitting back in her chair again, Lynn followed the gaze past Dr. Olsen, who was talking with Dr. Kai about the recent revival of yet another pre-evacuation Earth 1 sport. This one called Bass Bowl or Basic Ball. She could never remember which. She was familiar with basketball, of course, which had been popular on Earth 2 for over a century. And the Star office boasted its own mini basketball hoop, with a tennis ball standing in for the real and larger thing. However, she knew next to nothing about the sport they were discussing. It sounded like the sort of thing that should have been far too complex and cerebral to have enjoyed much in the way of general popularity. Even during the pre-cable TV era, when enormous numbers of people had roamed the streets in a desperate search for aesthetic or cultural gratification. Perhaps Olsen had told his security force to watch for people who might be roaming the woods in much smaller numbers for a different reason. She found it hard to believe that security hadn't had every inch of land wired to the point where a field mouse couldn't fart without them knowing it. And in case of flatulent fish, the waters of Veronica Lake were no doubt included in the surveillance. Or maybe it wasn't so hard to believe, she thought suddenly. Not if they didn't want anyone to know what they were venting waste from the plant into the lake. That would register immediately on their own security system, leaving a record that would have been just as difficult to conceal, if not more so. The auditors from the Regulatory Commission never slept, never blinked, and never gave warnings. All at once she saw Dr. Olsen sit up a little straighter and follow her gaze by looking over his shoulder at the lake and the surrounding woods. "Lonely, isn't it?" he said. "We employ full-time staff to keep it that way, too." Armed groundskeepers? Lynn asked, doing her best to sound guileless. I'd rather not put my employees in a potentially unsafe situation without some means of defending themselves, Olson said evenly. Lynn nodded and turned to Shabazz. And is that very hard, finding decent landscapers or horticulturalists who can also be trusted with loaded weapons? Shabazz gave her a half smile. Not for the military. You'd be surprised at the number of tree surgeons in uniform. His eyes swiveled to Olson, and instantly the amusement in his face vanished. Are you expecting trouble? Lynn asked, turning back to Olson. I mean, specifically at a specific time, like, say, now, from a specific area, like, say, the woods y'all keep looking at? Olson gave a small sigh. It's a sad fact that as far as the human race has come, literally and figuratively, there is still some element of risk to being out in the open like this. Lynn put on the expression of mock concern. And in spite of the potential danger, you didn't think to give me a weapon? You don't work for me, Olson said, then tried to cover his sharpness with a pleasant laugh that sounded just a little too forced. I don't think arming our guests is a terribly good way of making them feel at ease. She forced a pleasant laugh of her own, glancing past him to the woods. As opposed to armed guards at lunch. Yeah, I see what you mean. Olson didn't smile. Suddenly she was very overwhelmed with the sense that she had just used journalism as a pretense to be inexcusably ungracious, rude, even bullying. Shifting uncomfortably in her chair, she used the edge of a spoon to cut a slice of sweet orange-fleshed melon into smaller pieces just to have something else to do, while she contemplated her inadequate breeding. Shabazz cleared his throat with a polite, almost rueful noise. Frankly, I'm forced to agree. If I were the guest here instead of the employee, I would not find the presence of armed guards reassuring either. Startled, Lynn looked up. Shabazz was focused on Olson. He was as sedate and composed as ever, but the admonition in his expression was unmistakable. No, don't apologize, he added to Lynn, and she realized blatantly that she had started to say something, although now that he had stopped her, she couldn't imagine for the life of her what it might have been. If this were a foreign country, I'd be explaining that we forgot how strange our customs can seem to outsiders. But in fact, the power station has many characteristics in common with a foreign country, many of which are quite difficult, if not actually impossible, to articulate. Still gazing at Olson, he touched his right ear briefly and Lynn got it, feeling a little foolish for not understanding sooner. At least she had remembered to keep the log switched on. What am I missing? She asked, looking around at the three of them. Kai's expression was openly wary now. She turned to Olson with a silent question in her eyes, but he was staring back at Shabazz, his face cold with displeasure. It's better to be open about these things, Shabazz said, speaking as if in reply to a statement of Olson's that had only been heard by him. In this type of situation, it's more likely to work in our favor rather than against us. Lynn winced as her full stomach lurched slightly. We're in a situation? She asked. Not quite. Shabazz reached over and patted her hand reassuringly. It so happens that we have some trespassers in the woods near the lake. Not many, but unfortunately at least one of them seems to be more than a little unfriendly, and in a very proactive way. Proactive. Indeed. That word was one of Lynn's pet hates, a piece of meaningless overkill management speak. There was active, there was reactive, but she knew the battle on proactive and other elements of jargon had been lost on pre-back Earth over 5 centuries earlier. God, but they did love bullshit about human needs and caring for the workforce around here, Lynn thought. It took immense self-control, but she managed not to say, huh? The sarcasm probably would have been wasted on them. He took a little more time with the third one, even though he could sense she was moving in his direction. All he had to do was wait, and she would practically walk right into him. Instead, he circled around and got behind her. This was the one that had gotten the clearest look at him while he was still on his way up from the bottom of the lake. He didn't know whether she had understood what she was seeing or not, and he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was that he had understood what he had seen there above him in the dark, cold water. 3 naked human bodies. 3 living, naked human bodies. He had watched them reach the surface, and though they disappeared from view, he had had no trouble sensing where they were. When he had finally emerged from the water himself, he had moved quietly and with utmost care to avoid revealing his presence to them. Not because he thought he had anything to fear, he knew he didn't, but because he wanted to observe them. Their behavior might tell him something about his new killing ground, other than the fact that these were a lot of live things for him to wipe out. As the last live human made her way through the forest, repeatedly glancing at her watch for some reason, he moved out from behind her and positioned himself on a parallel route several yards to her right, drawing even with her. Now he deliberately let her hear a little extra noise as he paced her. Nothing very loud and not at all the time, but just enough to make her glance in his direction now and then. She was already uneasy, and now he could sense new anxiety waking inside her. The energy in his rebuilt body surged to a higher level, stimulated by the prey behavior she was inadvertently starting to exhibit. He made even more noise so she could be absolutely certain that she was not alone, but still didn't let her see him. She slowed down and then came to a stop near a large rotting log and a pair of thorny bushes that had grown together and were slowly strangling each other. "Mara?" she called. He crouched, remaining completely motionless. "Mara," she said again, a little louder, then with more confidence. "Sawyer, if this is you testing me to see how steady my nerves are, you're only proving what an asshole you are." He put his hand around the slender trunk of something he had once known as a birch tree and shook it. "What's that supposed to mean? You admit it?" He heard her take a step toward him and then stop. "Well?" He found a small stone and tossed it high enough so that she could see where it had come from, but without much force so that it landed roughly halfway between them. "If that was for me, you've got a lousy aim." He held still again, and finally she started toward him. "Sawyer, I don't know what you're doing or what you think you're doing, but you're really getting on my nerves right now. Just because we spend a few nights together now and then doesn't mean I'm not going to tell you when you're behaving like a..." He stood up, scant moments before she would have tripped over him. Immediately, her face contorted as she opened her mouth to scream, but he had already grabbed a fistful of hair at the top of her head with one hand while he swung the machete with the other. The stroke was so powerful, and the blade so razor-sharp that it went through her neck without otherwise disturbing her. She didn't scream, or fall, or even move. It was a rare moment of genuine surprise for him. He stood still clutching her hair and staring at her face, which wasn't quite as contorted as it had been. Now there seemed to be a faint glimmer of bewilderment in her eyes and long with terror. All at once there was a strangely airy, bubbling rasp as she let out a breath. The sound came not from her lips, however, but from the center point of the very thin red line marking the path the machete had taken through her neck. The line thickened as blood welled up out of it and began to trickle down towards her collarbone. Then a little more air expelled from her windpipe, and the rasp became a gurgle. Bubbles appeared in the line of blood on her neckline. The expression on her face faded slightly, although an observer might have read something like despair in her slackening mouth and heavy hidden eyes. Jason Voorhees had no words for what he saw, even in his enhanced state, but it was what he wanted to see. He yanked upward on her hair, lifting her head up off the stem of her neck. Some physical quirk, a dying twitch of muscle perhaps, caused her eyes to look down sharply, as if she were actually still conscious enough to register shock at what he had done. He waited for her headless corpse to topple over or crumple to the ground, but muscle spasms had taken control of her death. Her body stayed upright, not swaying even a little, as if it had been planted in front of him like a tree, or as if the body were clinging to some residual life left inside of it to remain standing as a way of defying him. Suddenly furious, he swung the machete again, slicing through the waist and severing most of the forearms. The upper torso fell away immediately, but the lower body stood for all of a second before it finally fell to the ground. He looked at the head dangling from his fist. All color had left the face, and the gray lips sagged shapelessly. There didn't seem to be any large branches around that he could use as a pipe, that he didn't go to any real trouble to search. There was no longer any point. She had been the last of the live humans in the forest. The rest of the life he sensed was elsewhere. His work here was done. He tossed the head over his shoulder and moved on. Sorry for the short video tonight. This has been Chapter 4 of Jason X The Experiment by Pat Cadigan. I'm not able to do any more tonight. I apologize for that. But tomorrow when I put up a new upload, I will include 3 chapters instead of 2. So tomorrow it'll be 5, 6, and 7. I hope you're enjoying the book so far. I'm really looking forward to where this story goes. I'm actually surprised it's got as interesting as it has so quickly into the book. The last 2 books seem to take a little bit before the action really started, so I'm happy to see this one isn't going that route. Please be sure to subscribe, spread the word, drop a comment, hit that like button, click the bell, so you know when future chapters are dropped. Until next time, thank you for listening.